Yes. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to this 6th day of the 7-day. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Of a 7-day online workshop on qualitative, mixed, and participatory methods. Today's session is on community-based participatory methods. I'm going to quickly reiterate the ground rules for our session. Please ensure that your mics are muted and your video is turned off during the session so as to not disturb our speaker. Yesterday, we had a couple of difficulties because of the same. And now I invite Akhila to give us a brief profile of our speaker for today, Professor Jayadantas.
Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Akhila TP, research scholar at the Department of Women's Studies, University of Calicut. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jaya Dantas. She is currently Deputy Chair of the Curtin Academic Board, Professor in the School of Population, Health, and Dean International in the Faculty of Health Science. Since 2018, she had led the Faculty Global Positioning Portfolio and previously held the Director of Graduate Research role. As a teaching and research academic, Professor Dantas leads a program of research in refugee and migrant health, teaches in the MPH program, and is an experienced PhD supervisor. In her 34-year career, she has worked in India, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Australia, received a national award for university teaching, is president of Australian Graduate Women, and has been a delegate to the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN. Having held leadership roles, she has a multi-dimensional lens on teaching, research, leadership, values, gender, and diversity. Now the session is over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Akhila. It's my pleasure to be here again today. And today what we'll be doing is I'll start with participatory methods. I'll give a brief overview of participatory methods. Then I'll give a brief overview of ethnography. These will be short overviews. Once I've done that, I will then share actual examples of studies we have done. So one of the studies was done in India in collaboration with the Center for Women's Studies at SNDT Women's University, and we undertook it in Gujarat, 3.5 hours from Mumbai, on the border of Gujarat, and we undertook that study. So I'll share that study. I'll also share, I shared a reading with Professor Molly yesterday on an ethnographic study that we took in Papua New Guinea, which is a neighboring country to Australia, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then also I will show you about a study that we did in Australia several years ago, where we captured the voices of refugee young people who were studying at the university and the challenges they face. So basically, I'm going to share different actual examples that we did. So I'll share my screen now. Are you able to see it, Yamini?
Yes, ma'am. We are able to see it.
Okay. So in these next few slides, I'm going to talk about participatory methods and action research. And what are both these methods? So I'm going to talk about participatory action research. I'm going to talk about participatory rural appraisal, and I'm going to talk about action research. And I've undertaken all of these three in the research that I've undertaken globally. So in participatory action research, this approach of research works collaboratively with participants. And that is why it's so powerful, because you actually work with communities. In participatory action research, it's called the PAR approach. You value participant knowledge, expertise, and voices. So any participatory methods that you will do, you'll co-design the methods that you will actually implement or the intervention along with the participants. In participatory action research, you try to understand the human lived experience of participants, and you engage with participants as co-investigators in dialogue and conversations. Dialogues shed light on how to address the research aims. Often this research aim is an issue that faces the community, that faces the participants. And this is really important here, that when you have this participatory approach, you actually go to the community and ask the community, what is the problem that you are facing? And how do we address or investigate this problem? Yeah. So one of the researchers Finney et al., they recognize that this co-construction of knowledge gathered with the community consists of a participatory process, and it emphasizes the fact, and this I want you all to all remember as you go ahead and do research, that research need not be done on participants, but it is actually being done with participants. So it's a collaborative process, and you actually do it with participants. So that is very powerful, because you don't do research on the participants, on the subjects, but you actually do it collaboratively with them. So some of the key features of participatory action research is that no individualization is possible without socialization, and no socialization is possible without individuation. So it's important to remember that an individual is part of a social group. And this is really important in participatory action research, that it's not only you recognize the individual, but you recognize that the individual is part of a community. And it's a process whereby people endeavor to understand their situation and completely examine and re-examine their situation with the aim of improvement. So they understand that this is the problem we are facing. And this could be a problem of youth violence. This could be a problem of alcoholism in the community. This could be a problem of gender-based violence. But then they say that this is what we have identified. How can we now change this or improve this situation? And action research is participatory. It is collaborative. It engages participants in examining their own understanding, skills, values, and knowledge, and the ways in which they construct actions. So why is it powerful? Is because you give, in so many ways, co-design the project and work with the participants, giving them also power in the research process. So it's practical and it's collaborative. It is a process in which participants investigate practices which are often taken for granted, with the intent of exposing practices that might be unproductive, unsatisfactory, or unjust. And the aim is to improve this. The other thing is it's also emancipatory, because it aims to help people recover. It aims to help people release themselves from the constraints of irrational, unproductive, unjust, and unsatisfying social structures that limit self-development and self-determination. And I think many of us can relate to this, that our social structures can have constraints that actually really can be unjust. And at the same time, they can create arbitrary barriers towards self-development and self-improvement and self-determination. It's also reflexive. And I have diagrams towards the end to show how it's reflexive, because it aims to transform practices to a cyclical, spiraling process of critical self and group reflection. So there's constant reflection in the participatory action research process. It's also transformative, because it is transformative in both theory and practice. It aims to transform practitioners' theories and practices that shape the conditions of life and work in particular local settings. So all of us work in local settings. And with the research that we do and with the participatory research that we do, we aim to transform practitioners' both theories and practice. So we actually stretch the boundaries of theories that are there. And I like the term that they've used where it's emancipatory too. It also has a feminist communitarian ethic. And Denson and Lincoln endorse this because with participatory action research, it calls for a trusting, collaborative, non-oppressive relationship among the co-researchers. And such an ethic presumes that investigators are committed to recognizing personal accountability, the value of individual expressiveness and caring, the capacity for empathy, and the sharing of emotionality or emotions. Now, this is really important here. And I think those of you who work in gender studies and in women's studies, this is really important, this feminist communitarian ethic. And I would like you all, when you all are in your study groups with Professor Morley or with your study guides, to think about this feminist communitarian ethic and how this ethic gives investigators personal accountability and also the capacity for empathy. From participatory action research, we come to participatory rural appraisal. And in this evolved in the 1980s to find a way in which local people working at the grassroots level in rural communities, in development projects, could play a more active role in what was happening at the ground level. The response stemmed from a growing dissatisfaction with existing practices in which development practitioners collected information, used the information to plan, manage, and evaluate development projects for the poor. So that model is changing because you say it has to be community-led. And we do that, we try and do that. We have not always done it in Australia with our Indigenous populations. Our Indigenous health indicators are terrible in Western Australia, in the whole of Australia, actually, because if an Australian man and woman lives in the ages of 80 to 85 years, we have Indigenous men and women 20 years less. So there is a wide disparity. And they also called for actually having health practices or health programs that are community-led by their community members and by simple messages that can improve their well-being. So the principles of participatory rural appraisal is a reversal of learning. So I, as a researcher, also learn from the communities. What is happening in the communities? What is happening in the lives of these people that improvements can be made? How can we learn progressively? How can we offset biases? How can we seek diversity? How can we share? But the most important thing is handing over the pen, where you do local analysis with the communities. So this is another important aspect of participatory rural appraisal. Then the pillars, some of the pillars is outsiders facilitate, not dominate the process. So if I go as Jaya going into a rural community, I am facilitating the process. I don't want to tell the people what they should do or how they should do it, but I only facilitate listening to their voices. The methods shift from close to open, from individual to group, from verbal to visual, and from measuring to comparing. This is really important, that you have to be open with communities. Often communities have a lot of knowledge. This is knowledge that they have, that is culturally handed down. This is knowledge that they have learned from their mothers and grandmothers and their fathers and grandfathers and the village elders. And often it might not be, it might be verbal, but also visual. And often it's individual and group. The community and the village look after each other when they can and when they are given the capacity to do so. And the sharing of information and experience between insiders and outsiders. Now, this is where I start with some of the models, and I have used them extensively in the field. And I encourage you to look at them, ask me questions, and also apply them when you can. So Annette and Rifkin's rural participatory appraisal is a research method for collecting information needed for formulating an action plan within a short period of time, without a large expenditure of professional time or finances, and with the involvement of community members. So when you go into the field, if you use this model of rural participatory appraisal or participatory rural appraisal, you would be able to gather rich information. So this is something that I've used and has worked really well. So this is the information pyramid and community assets that we have here. And several of my students have used it. So I'm going to share one of the studies, but I shared one of the papers with Professor Molly yesterday, and that was a study done in Nepal. And she also used this information pyramid to gather information on the community assets. At the base level, you have community composition, community organization, and community capacity. At the middle level, it's physical environment, socioeconomic environment, and disease and disability. At the next level, it's education, health, and social services. And at the top level, it's health policy. Now, this is the cycle that I've used. And it's a wonderful cycle if you look at that. Now, the previous slide that I showed you, this information pyramid, is these pyramids at the top that you can see. They're on the top, the two triangles, the pyramids on the top. And then you have the cycles, you see. It's the health information pyramid plus assets, and then you communicate with the group, you plan, you collect the information, you analyze the information, you discuss and communicate, you plan and take action. Once again, after that action, you collect information and you analyze. And these cycles can continue. You look at the assets in the community. You collect the information. Now, I've said health information pyramid, but that can be an education information pyramid. That can be a gender pyramid. It can be any. Our focus often in the work that I do in global public health is on health. So this is the interacting spirals of action research, where you look, you think, you act, and then again you look, you think, you act. And I'll say something about this a little later. So we've talked about participatory action research. We've talked about participatory rural appraisal or rural participatory appraisal. And now we talk about action research. So action research as a research design has become particularly attractive to educators because of its practical problem-solving emphasis, and because practitioners carry out the investigation, and the investigation is directed towards a greater understanding of their own practice. So action research is about exploring with stakeholders to generate and study change and to investigate processes that you may want to implement. It can produce changed ways of doing things and changed ways of understanding why we do what we do. So this is the action research cycle. And this is a study I personally had undertaken when I lived in Uganda, in East Africa, from 1993 to 1997, over 4 years. So first I was given a leadership position. This was after the conflict in Rwanda. And after the conflict in Rwanda, they wanted to rebuild the education and health system. They had 2 decades of conflict, 20 years of conflict, brutal regime, civil conflict, brutal regimes of Idi Amin and Milton Obote. It really disseminated the country in many ways. And at the same time, people were traumatized. They had huge communicable diseases. They had the HIV pandemic, and they also had civil war in the north with South Sudan. Lots of refugees, so lots of problems. And I was in the country after it attained stability in 86, so 7 years after a little bit of stability. But there was still army on the streets, gunfire at night, lots of poor conditions, load shedding of electricity, several hours of the evening, several times of the week. And here I had to provide strong leadership in the act. Then I had to define a plan and develop a vision. Then we had to implement that planning. And then we had to reflect and we had to draw conclusions. And then we had to observe, monitor, and give feedback. So this was the cycle that we used, the action research cycle. And I'm proud to say that the small school at that time I started in 1994 January. 1993 I took up the position, and 1994 today is a huge school. So it's got 3 sections right up to high school. From early years, we worked with local teachers. We had a cascade approach to train our trainers. So action research combined reflective practice, the empowerment of teachers. So in action research, you empower people. Here it was in this example, teachers. Professional development. So it's ongoing professional development or professional growth of communities, in communities. Active learning. So there was active learning all the time. There was collaboration between people. And this was the cascade approach. So what is a cascade approach in the training of trainers? So you have a team of local participants. You recruit and train them to provide workshops and intensive field-based assessments. And then with the participatory approach, they go ahead and have school improvement projects somewhere else. So they train someone else. So with one training of trainers, we trained 5 trainers who then went somewhere else and trained others. So this was really important in this cascade approach where the trainers increased. So it worked with group discussions. It worked with activity-based learning, and it worked with greater participation. And finally, in 2007, so I worked there, I worked in Rwanda, I came to Australia, and in 2007, and Professor Molly, you've talked about International Women's Day now. This was International Women's Day 2007, and I was invited to a mining town in Kalgoorlie, which is 7 hours from where I live, from Perth to Kalgoorlie, which is a huge mining town. We are a mining state. We have lots of mining. We have gold, we have diamonds, we have iron ore, we have copper, we have lithium, we have lots of mines. And in this mining town, I was invited, and I was one of the speakers, and I was a migrant woman, and the other speaker was an Aboriginal elder woman. And she says something that has remained with me. She said, I needed to listen. Action begins with a desire to listen and a heart that hears. So she was a Yamaji Yingarda Aboriginal elder woman, and that has stayed with me. So even as researchers, we need to actually be able to listen to our communities, especially as qualitative participatory researchers. And we also need to empathize with our communities. And as researchers, we need to also put into practice these strong frameworks, maybe of participatory action research, maybe of participatory rural appraisal, or action research that can be implemented. So that finishes. I'll stop my participatory action research. I'll stop sharing that one and go to the next one. I wanted to ask Professor Molly, shall I go and do all the presentation and then open it up to discussion? Would that be better?
That will be better. Otherwise, there will be time limitations. People go on asking questions and then you won't be able to go through the other important aspects. So
Okay.
let us move to the next.
Yes.
And we will take the questions at the end.
Okay.
Okay.
So next one that I'm going to is ethnography. Yeah. So I will open up ethnography and then share it with the group. Are you able to see Professor Molly?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So when we talk about ethnography, it's important to realize that it has got a strong, it's embedded in strong principles of different critical theory, cultural studies, symbolic interactionism, and structural functionalism. So for those of you who are finishing your PhDs and will go ahead to become academics in departments of sociology, anthropology, history, philosophy, gender studies, it's really important to match your method that you might use with some of the methodology or strong theoretical base. And with the ethnographic method, it's a very strong method, especially used in gender studies, but it also has links to structural functionalism, symbolic interactionism, critical theory, and cultural studies. And I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of these theoretical underpinnings and orientations, what it means in the next few slides. So structural functionalists deal with social institutions. And social institutions have a role to play in keeping entire society alive. They prefer to focus on society, family, economy, beliefs. They pay comparatively little attention to art or language or technology or the national environment. A sense of universality means that all social institutions and their functions are assumed to be equal structures in all society. So sometimes, remember that structural functionalists look at structures in a society. So this is how society works and the subsystem works. This is how the family should work. This is how the economy should work. This is how the political institutions should work, and this is how belief should work. And this you might relate to because some are very rigid in their structures and are very resistant to change, even if change is happening. So those are the structural functionalists. So structural functionalists and ethnography. So in this, it relies heavily on the personal interactions of the researcher and their participants or subjects. The data are believed to be real. The circumstances in which data is collected cannot be easily replicated. And this is because you're doing it in a certain structure. So if you go into an environment where it's a very traditional environment, say in certain cultures, in certain religions, where structures are very rigid, it requires immersion in those particular societies. So that is why when it's structural ethnography from this tradition, it means you will go and live with a family. So you will say, oh, I want to learn about the hill tribes in, say, Nagaland. if I want to learn about the hill tribes in Nagaland, I will go and spend 3 to 6 months in the field with them. I will try and understand their structures. I'll try and see how they work within those structures and get an understanding. Because we cannot get that structure that is there with the Sherpas in Nepal, say, or with the tribals in Nagaland, or with certain tribal communities, or with certain Muslim communities, or with certain communities, like say the fisher folk community, anywhere else. And that is why structures, social structures are embedded within certain societies. The next one is symbolic interaction. And I do like symbolic interactionism because I feel that our whole world is the learned meanings and its code of symbols which are shared through interactions in a given social group. Symbols motivate people to carry out their activities. The human mind itself grows and changes in response to interaction in which individual engages. And ethnographic fieldwork in this tradition, symbolic interactionist tradition, is geared towards uncovering the meanings human beings and participants attach to their actions and symbols. And I am going to ask you a question about symbolic interactionism and ethnography in this tradition, because I feel it's so powerful with symbols. And our world is filled with symbols. Think about it, like as women, a married woman will have symbols that she'll use, the type of bangle she wears, the type of chain or Mangal Sutra that she adorns, the type of red sindoor that she'll put in Indian tradition. Then we have different types of saris worn at different traditional events. But you also have our religious leaders wearing certain symbols, whether in the Christian tradition, whether when you have gurus, they seem to have a certain symbolic attire. You have nuns having a certain symbolic attire that they represent. But you have very negative ones. We have negative symbols that are there with, say, the neo-Nazis, the symbols, the Ku Klux Klans, these are symbols. But we also have symbolic tattoos of gangs, So symbolic interactionism is really important, and learning about these symbols in an ethnographic tradition is really important. So I'm going to ask all of y'all to think about this. I'm giving you the chance now while I'm actually presenting, so you all can think about these as to what have you all seen in the tradition. See, one of the powerful symbols we have, like in New Zealand, the Maoris have facial symbols. This is a sign of their connection to their tribe, to their life. And it's powerful. And they have embraced it fully. Those symbols, they don't worry whether people like it or not. And if you have not seen, but the New Zealand foreign minister is a Maori woman, and she has a face tattoo, and she goes to international meetings with that face tattoo. So that's and she interacts with that symbolism. And people were shocked that, the New Zealand prime minister, who's a woman, wonderful young woman, actually appointed a Maori woman with a facial symbol, So those symbols are powerful in life, and it happens across the world. So this is a question that I'll ask you when we finish. Then we have critical theory and ethnography. So they have a style, critical theorists have a style of ethnographic research that is a dialogue, that is dialectic, that's collaborative. So you dialogue with the participants, you talk to the participants, you ask their perspective about a certain truth, about values, and behaviors. So basically, in critical theory, they are not all subjects, but they are collaborators. So it's in form, it's also linked to participatory action research. And as much as possible, you involve the community in the design and implementation of critical theory research, because you want them to tell you what is happening about things that are happening in their lives, the difficulties, the challenges, the barriers they faced. And now I did a rapid ethnographic assessment in Sri Lanka in 2006, early 2006. And it was a UNICEF project, and I was asked to go into the conflict areas of Sri Lanka. And now when I look, this was before the peace talks with the LTT broke down. And I went to 6 of the 8 conflict districts of Sri Lanka at that time. I don't know how I did it, but I did it at that time. I went with another colleague of mine who was a medical doctor from Germany, and we went together in these districts of Batiklova, Ampara, Manar, Mulaitivu, Kilinochi. So we went to these districts, and now when I look back on the dialogue that I had with the child soldiers, the dialogue that I had with the conflict widows, and I was fortunate or unfortunate to also go to the LTT headquarters in Kilinochi at that time, and talk to their education lead at that time, and see the structures of how the Sri Lankan people lived within a zone of rebel-held territory, where you needed a passport to go into those territories, and how people lived with the complexities of their lives. So this dialogue that I had with multiple women, it was in 6 weeks we did this rapid ethnographic assessment. I was not allowed to publish this because it was because of the sensitivity, and it was by UNICEF. But anytime anyone wants to read it, I have it as a report, and I can share this. But it was really powerful ethnography. Then it comes to cultural studies. So cultural scholars are concerned with cultural text. So basically, it's with text, how meanings are produced, what is gender, race, ethnicity, social class, determinants of how culture impacts society, and they're conscious of their own biographies, which are legitimate part of the story. So cultural studies are by definition very interdisciplinary, and they transcend anthropology, sociology, psychology, and history. And it's a very good way of doing research. It's very powerful. So I did this study in Sri Lanka. My student did this study in Papua New Guinea, and she has published 4 papers. I was just telling Professor Molly, I've shared one of those papers. So it's looking at traditional societies, reconstructing their cultural traditions, having a critical dialogue with them, looking at the symbols that they use, and you're concerned with the routine everyday lives of people we study. And they collect data about lived human experience in order to understand predictable patterns. And it's usually on site. So ethnography is always field-based. I cannot do ethnographic research sitting in Perth. I have to go into the field. I am, for that period of time, moving in the community, a participant in the community. So it falls under a continuum of 4 main points, where you could be the complete participant, where you're completely immersed in the community. So if I want to do an ethnographic study, say, with Professor Molly in Calicut, looking at the interactions of postgraduate students in this complex environment, then you share that. So in some ways, sometimes you may or may not disclose their research agenda. So you're just observing. You want people to behave normally. You don't want them to behave differently if they come to know that you're observing them. Then you're the participant observer. So you also conduct research, but you do it with their permission, and you also participate. So you want to see what people are doing, and basically you want to actually have an understanding of their lives. So this is a participant observer. You participate in their tradition, you participate in their lives. And basically, this is important. Then the next one is non-participant observer. So the researcher is detached from the community, interacting only on specific occasions to conduct interviews and functions. So you are an observer, but you're non-participant. And basically, you interact in festivals, you interact in, if you're doing an observational study. So you don't participate, but you're observer, but you tell people that you'll be observing and you will be talking, you'll be attending functions, etc. And then you're the complete observer. So you collect observer without big involvement or announcing presence, but from afar. So you don't want to risk change in behaviors, but you want to do that. And sometimes it can be sensitive. So if you're doing research, looking at interactions in, say, you will let someone know, but in say, you're looking at drug addicts, or so there are these ethical issues you have to grapple with, or in a pub setting where you're looking at alcoholics interacting. So all you're doing is you're just observing how these interaction take place. And then each of the roles is potentially useful depending on the circumstances. So the context of the research is field-based, conducted in settings in which people live. It is personalized. It's conducted by research who are in day-to-day, face-to-face contact with people they are studying. So they are both participants and observers. Multifactorial, because there can be 2 or more data collection techniques. It requires long-term commitment. So you can't do it in a week or 2 weeks. It just doesn't. You need to know the community. And I tell my students, if they have to do an ethnographic study, they have to be there for a longer period of time. And this can vary depending on the resources you have, depending on the funding you might have. But it will definitely be anywhere from 3 to 6 months if possible. And it's dialogic, conducted by the researchers, whose conclusions and interpretations can be commented upon. It is holistic, conducted so as to yield the fullest possible portrait of the group under study. It is the role for the ethnographer writer in giving voice as best as you can. And it's important to remember that you actually are giving voice to the participants under study. And the people who are being studied should also be allowed to speak for themselves where possible. And I just wanted to share how can we use ethnography in health programs. So basically, it looks at social inequality in lives of men and women and children. And this relationship, so we have used ethnography in aspects such as domestic violence, youth substance abuse, community health, refugee and migrant health, reproductive health, and other projects. So it is possible to use ethnography in health. So I wanted to share this. So I will now show the actual studies, and then we'll go into the question and answer session. Is that okay, Professor Molly?
Yes, very fine.
So just can you see the slide?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So this was participatory action research to address community prioritized health concerns in disadvantaged communities so that they could improve their practice. And this was done with one of my PhD students, Dr. Clancy Reed. So Clancy was passionate about international work. Her passion was actually undertaking international work. So she conducted the study. She came from Australia. She's Australian, white Australian. She came from Australia, had a scholarship, went to India, collected data with the Research Center for Women's Studies. We had a partnership with them. I got small funding for the project. And then after she was there, she then went with her husband to the Philippines and was in the Philippines. And while she was in the Philippines, the Fukushima nuclear disaster took place in Japan. And she was able to undertake a WHO project there. Now, her husband is Mexican, and they decided after a PhD to go and live in Mexico. And she used the approaches that she had used to start a small NGO and a project in Mexico. So she did the project and she did various projects in Mexico, had her first child, and came back to Australia, where she got a job as a qualitative researcher in child health, looking at rheumatic heart disease in Aboriginal communities. So in our Aboriginal communities, we have rheumatic heart disease in children. And that is what she was looking at as a qualitative health researcher. She finished that assignment, and currently she is in Fiji working on another project with 2 young kids. So, it is possible to do international work with qualitative methods and participatory methods. So with this little background, I'll share the study that she did. So we were at the Center for International Health, which was my center. Previously, we were with the Center for Rural Development, which was a branch of the Research Center for Women's Studies. And we had the SNDT Women's University in India. And the study area was southern Gujarat. There were 79 villages in that area, and 5 were chosen for the study. In that, there were 39% scheduled tribes, and they were recognized in the Constitution of India, this, as a historically disadvantaged people who require affirmative government policies. And 83% are below the poverty line. 83% live still below the poverty line. So a lot of affirmative action is required. So this was the stage 1. And in the stage 1, she used the pyramid. She used Annett and Rifkin's looking at rapid health needs assessment of the villages to examine the health issues of the villagers and to determine the key priorities so that a plan of action could be made. Her message was rapid participatory appraisal. So she had the health pyramids, she had rapid participatory appraisal, but she said, do not collect too much irrelevant information, adjust the investigation to reflect local conditions and involve the community, both in defining community needs and seeking possible solution. So she triangulated the method with 23 key informant and focus group interviews. So she managed in the time she was there to have 82 participants, 23 key informants. She did direct observations. She had reports and other documentation. And with the people, this is what she identified, that there was huge amounts of environmental pollution. And this is because the area has been designated as an EPZ, the economic production zone by the government. So there's lots of factories, but environmentally, they are producing real effluents into the waterways and pollutants into the environment. And people, the villagers were aware of it. And it was interesting that these poor villagers were telling Clancy that, we've seen our fish are dying. We've seen that there's an increase in cancers, They had alcohol-related problems, which to us, both to Clancy and me, because I visited her there, I went with her, and then I visited her there, is that Gujarat is supposed to be a dry state, but alcohol was a problem. So there was alcohol coming into the state. There were poverty-related problems. The other problem, which is a huge problem in the whole of India, is a problem with road safety. Then poor health services. And this is something that's a problem with regional disparities in India. And accessibility or acceptability of health services. When you look at social determinants, when people are poor, when people are less literate, their uptake of health services is lower. So the first stage was the assessment. This is what we found. The second stage is the action intervention. So this was to transform the knowledge generated in stage one by applying a participatory approach to action intervention. So this was community-based participatory results. So, here is Clancy. You can't see her very well, but here is Clancy sitting in front of the school visit with all the children. Very happy to see her. Schools we visit, very happy children, even if the schools are poorly resourced. On the other side is a women's group, and in a very thing, I'm sitting on a chair here. Clancy is conducting a focus group here. And this was the knowledge to action transition. There's change, there's knowledge, there's action. So knowledge to action. And the factors affecting transfer of knowledge, there was environmental factors, community factors, organizational factors, practitioner and researcher factors. The environmental factors, risk resulting from participants. So participants were worried if they took part in the intervention in a community-based participatory project, can there be any risk? They said, oh, y'all have come, y'all would like to do this, but we have to live here. There are powerful corporations or corporate with other entrenched interests, and this could be a problem. And they were also worried about the loss of wage and time. And it can be challenging to overcome the legacy left behind by previous researchers. Promises not kept, abandoning after data collection. So this becomes a reality. And sometimes it's a very practical reality and something that we can discuss in our meeting. So Clancy also attended a health camp, and she had a wonderful interpreter who actually worked with her during the project. And we looked at the organizational factors. What was the availability of resources? What was the capacity of the organization and initiators of change? What was the level of trust in the community and these initiators of change? The community factors, often it was timing. It was level of engagement with the community. It was community motivation for change and agreement of the community on the issue being addressed. And the cultural safety protocol. We wanted the community to be safe because we knew we were going to be there for a month, 2 months, and we were going to leave. But what happens to the people? They are going to remain behind. So the intervention should protect them. It should not cause any difficulty for them. So practitioner focus. So always remember the power in balance. Even outsiders who pride themselves on being community allies and trusted friends, sometimes we fail to realize the extent of the power imbibed by our own multiple sources of privilege and how it can adversely affect interactions or outcomes. So we, just by the very nature of our education, may have this power imbalance. The time allocated for the project, and this becomes across the board everywhere. Budget constraints and time constraints are a challenge for any type of project. So this was Clancy in a focus group with the participants here. And some of the conclusions here, we looked at contextual factors. So we have to see that the community all have a role in affecting the transformation of knowledge to action. these factors are different from the methodological decisions we make. And if there are failures, we shouldn't be disheartened, but we need to scrutinize those failures and the reasons why possibly the interventions have not achieved the desired outcomes. Yeah? And Clancy, one of the things that I ask my students to do is the final output. There should be an output apart from your publications. So Clancy had a book chapter. She had press conference presentations. She had her thesis. But I said, have something that can be shared by the community. And this is what she wanted to do, a conceptual framework, an approach to participatory action research that she expanded. So where there's the researcher output, the community output, the assessment and the intervention, and the mobilization, reflecting, observation, acting, and planning cycle. And then there's the community input also there. So this is what she came up with the conceptual output. And then she modified it to include the participatory action research model. So she had the assessment model, and then she also put the knowledge action change model. And this was one of the outputs. So I like my students to have a diagram in the last chapter of their thesis where they propose a framework. They propose a model that they can share with the academics or with the wide world or with the community. And some of the conclusion, we can assess factors affecting knowledge to action before commencing an action intervention study, because you can also give an indication of anything requiring amendment. And further research is encouraged. Although participatory action research is challenging, particularly when applied in disadvantaged communities in complex environment, it actually gives hope. It gave these women who talked to Clancy a chance to actually talk to us, to talk about the complexities of their lives. And we as researchers learned so much about the economic processing zones. We learned so much about the environmental factors. We learned so much about the road accidents taking place and the ability of these women to actually contextualize and share the challenges of their lives, and their resilience in some ways. So that's one of the studies, Professor Molly.
Hello.
So I'm going to the next study now, and I'll finish that, and then we'll go to the questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay, bye.
Now the next one. I have to show this one. So what I wanted to do is very quickly share something. Now, this is another Photo Voice project I've done. And basically, what I wanted to share in this is embedded in these slides are voices of participants. And that's where the ethnographic part comes in place. So I will actually skip some slides because we've talked about Photo Voice and others, and I will go to the slides where I wanted the voice of the participants to be focused on.
Oh, that's excellent.
So what I wanted to just say is this project focused on refugee young people. So my other Photo Voice project focused on refugee women. This was on photo voice of young people. And these were refugees. And just to give you a little bit of a background, and some of you might know this, but others may not know this, but this is what is happening in the world today with Ukraine. And it is forced migration. So there's a difference between forced and voluntary migration. So involuntary, people choose where they live and why they move. So for me, I was a voluntary multiple migrant. I'd lived in 5 countries. I'd worked as a professional migrant. But in forced migration, people are made to move often with little notice and no choice. And that happens with war and civil conflict. Voluntary migrants are often pulled. They're drawn to better opportunities. So we have thousands of expatriate Indians working in the Middle East and in other countries. But forced migrants are internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and refugees. Now, this is an old figure, but I have a recent figure from 2019 and 2020, just before the COVID pandemic. And we have 282 million people on the move in the world. So that's more than a quarter of a billion people that actually move as voluntary and forced migrants. But in that, refugees form a huge amount, 60 million. So you have seen people arriving by boat in Australia who are treated in an appalling manner in detention. You have seen those who go on from the Middle East and the Mediterranean Sea and take these precarious journeys where they even die, but they want to escape extreme poverty. We've seen the migrants from South America and Central America from really politically unstable and violent regimes of Honduras, Nicaragua, where people feel, and Ecuador, where there's high gang violence, where people want to move to other countries. So these are difficult situations. So Australia has a humanitarian program. We've taken anywhere between 15 to 20,000 refugees through the humanitarian program, not by boat, but they are brought in as refugees from overseas. So I won't talk about these because this focused on USA. I did this presentation at Old Dominion University and at University of Toronto. I did this in 2016 at the Old Dominion University. And we were looking at youth experiences of successful resettlement in Australia and the various domains of language, house, security, education, personal safety. Now, one thing I would like to say is another thing that I like my PhD students to do and scholars to do is to use a conceptual framework that underpins their study. And they use various frameworks. So they use this is a psychosocial framework, and I have used it for a number of studies. I personally have used it in many of my research studies. But my students also use the health behavior framework. Then they use Bronfenbrenner's social ecological framework. Then they use the health communication framework. So any framework that you'll find that can underpin your analysis is quite powerful and makes it easy to align the themes that you get from thematic analysis within the framework. So in this study, there were 35 refugee youth and 12 key informants, and they were from the countries of Congo, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Pakistan. They had been resettled in Australia. We used photo voice and we used photo narratives. And I've talked about this, so I won't go into this. And I've talked about the various photo voice projects done over the world. But so this was some of the photographs where they talked about language, the human capacity, support structures, and at the same time, they also talked about education. So see, they had a challenge. They came from these war-torn countries of Africa, and then they had this complexity with the Australian education system, where there's a pressure from everyone else. There's a constant reminder that you're on your own. You have to actually be independent. It's a way of studying where you can't rely on your teachers. It gives you the chance. And what we have done is we have captured the voices of some participants, and I want to share those with you.
Ma'am,
There's no voice.
yeah, we are unable to hear her. Both of them actually. Could we see?
Can you hear Yamini?
No, we can't hear.
No, we can't hear. Hmm. We can hear you,
What?
but not the video. Could we see?
Can you hear now?
Still no.
No,
No, ma'am.
Oh, okay.
Are they speaking in English?
English.
Okay.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I can hear it, but you can't hear it.
No, we can't hear.
Just a minute. Let me see. I'll try now. Can you hear now?
No,
no, ma'am.
still no.
Can you hear now, Yamini?
No, still no.
Okay. I will go ahead then.
Yeah, no problem. Let us move ahead.
So they were sharing, and I've captured these voices. I'm not sure why. I think on Zoom it becomes more difficult, you know? So we had some wonderful participants who participated in the project, and we captured their voices. And I take this with me, but I wanted to show you the exhibition. So this is how the Photo Voice project is a traveling exhibition. We have these pull-up banners that we take with us, and we take it around the world. They are pull-up banners, and they are displayed at conference venues, and they're displayed in libraries and in other universities where we share this methodology. You know? And some of the photos I'll just share that the young people. So this is the young people. I wanted to just share one, which I wanted to share with you. So this is a young Iranian lady. Her husband came by boat to Australia, and then she got married. And she wanted me to put that photograph, you know, she captured an image in this exhibition because she said this was her journey. You know, her husband was in asylum, he was in detention, and now he's living in Australia. Now they moved from Perth to Melbourne, and that was powerful. And she's there. She came for the launch of the project, and I'll show you, you know. And then there's the story of Bill. If you look at Bill on the top with his children, he was a social worker in Sierra Leone, and his son, who is to his left, the boy at the back, you know. So his son disappeared during the war. He couldn't find his son. So his son was a child soldier in Sierra Leone for some time, and then came down to, they found him, and then they came to Perth. So that's a big thing for these refugees, you know, when they come here, you know. And here's the young woman who had got married and wanted the photograph. And here are the South Sudanese young people in front of the exhibition. And this is the whole team of all our participants with myself. But I would like to just share this Somali girl who was so powerful. You know, she said, I want to become a nurse. I want to work in the Australian hospitals. And the day I cried was when we came to Australia, and my father, who was an engineer in Somalia, had then to become a taxi driver in Australia because he didn't speak good enough English, and his qualifications from Somalia were not recognized. So that was heartbreaking for her. But she has gone to university in Australia and is now a nurse. So that's a story of success. And we had some really good success stories from some of these participants who took part in the study. Yeah? So I shall stop now, Professor Molly, and we can throw it open to questions on participatory action research and on ethnography.
Wonderful, Jaya. An excellent presentation. I just can't believe how you could talk continuously for almost 1.5 hours. My God.
I didn't even realize the time.
Yeah,
I couldn't
the time
see the
is
time.
going like anything else. You were talking continuously, and we all people were wondering at your journey, how you could do all these with the people, among the people, using their photo voices or their in-depth interviews. How you are doing all this, it is something amazing, and some models for we people. Your every research work is a model. And I'm so happy that we could get you. We are so fortunate to have you as a research person, because I think I will be taking more of your methods in my future studies.
Yes.
Because there are so much of opportunities here also.
Yes.
In India also, in Kerala also, we have so many opportunities, but we are not thinking about them. So now I think I'm rethinking how to grab some opportunities. So many we have to study, and we can use these participatory methods. And since we are using small samples, it could be done even by PhD scholars.
Yes.
Yeah, that could be done.
I mean, a lot of the studies that I've shared, the publications that I've shared with you, are my PhD scholars.
Oh, okay.
They're all PhD students who have done these studies in the field, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. Now, shall we move on to the questions and answers?
Yes.
Raja, can you read out the questions?
Yes,
please.
I will read the questions.
Yeah.
So, Sabah Hussain has asked the first question. She has asked, are in ethical grounds breached in the complete observer ethnography? She has actually asked two questions, but I think I will just say this question first. So, ma'am, have you got the question?
Oh, yes. I've got the first question, which is the ethical grounds breached in complete observer ethnography. You know? So one thing I will say is you will actually go through the ethics process at your university or whichever ethical agency that you're applying for. So most of my students do too. They do Curtin University as well as in-country study. And then when they are there, they will talk to one of the elders or someone that this is what they want to do. Do they have permission to do that? Because they don't want to compromise in some ways that the quality of the data that they'll receive if they open it up. You know, if they open it up, you know, if people know who they are, they won't behave how they should behave or how they are meant to behave. So that is, but if your supervisor, if your university, if you are very aware of this, then you're aware of the ethical issues. So in this, it is observation and it's observer in ethnography, but you're using that method where you're not taking informed consent of the participants, but you're doing it for the reason. So you'll only do complete observer ethnography for certain reasons in certain cases where if you feel that disclosing yourself jeopardizes the study.
Okay, ma'am. So the second question again by Sabah Hussain is that, are ethnography and grounded theory mutually exclusive? Because in grounded theory, we come up with hypothesis after the collection of data, whereas in ethnography, we have fair idea of objectives and hypothesis.
Yes. Yeah. So grounded theory is ethnography is a methodology that you might use, or grounded theory. So in some ways, if you say you're doing ethnography you will have to be separate, because in grounded theory, you are developing a theory or framework, so there are two different methodologies that you'll use,
Okay. Then the next question is by Paul J. He has asked, a tribal community has many different ethnographic backgrounds and origins, but government records are categorizing them as a single tribal group and implementing developmental schemes. How can we examine their development in all aspects, whereas they have different characteristics? Yes.
Yes, they have different characteristics. You cannot actually categorize them singly together. You cannot do that. And I don't know how you can change that. We have changed that in Australia because our indigenous communities in every part of Australia are different. So we say the mob, we call them, the clans or the mobs, not in a derogatory way, but in the indigenous way. So the indigenous people, say in Northern Territory, are different from Western Australia, are different from Tasmania. So you actually, when you have development programs or health programs, you have to use the community people from those communities. You cannot use them from some other community. And we have realized that. And I think you'll have to realize that, because a tribal community, say in Southern India, is very, very different to the Northeast, are very different to Northern India or Gujarat. So they're all very distinct. And in India, even the cultures in each state are different. So you cannot put it together, even though the government has done that. Maybe it has done that for characterizing, for census purposes or something. But even then, it's important when it comes to projects and research, you separate them according to the region that they are in and their own identity and characteristics.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I'm not seeing any other questions. Is that all? Many people have commented about this session. Other than that, I'm not seeing any other questions.
Yeah.
And
Okay, one more question is there.
There are no questions from YouTube yet.
Okay, I will read another question. Ipshida Mitra has asked, can a complete observer in an ethnographic project conduct in-depth interviews? Yes.
If you're actually doing in-depth interviews, then you will have to disclose yourself. So you have done observations, and then you want to also conduct interviews. With the in-depth interviews, you'll have to disclose yourself, because you need to say that this is a study, and the questions themselves will show that this is what you're doing. So if you want to actually have some rich in-depth interviews, then you can't be only a complete observer. You'd have to have the opportunity to interview, unless you do complete observations, but then you interview only a small group of people whom you'll say, we want to interview you because we want to understand this. We won't identify you. You won't be visual. We can do it in a certain way, because in certain very sensitive topics, people, you can observe people, but when actually you have to talk to people, you'll have to talk to a few who you get their complete trust. They will share with you, but they don't want, like when I was doing my field work in Rwanda, I was observing things, and it was after the genocide, and basically they said, no, you can't record, you have to handwrite. We don't want to be recorded, because you'll be able to recognize our voices. So then they said, oh, we'll talk to you, but we can't talk to you in a cafe or anywhere. We'll talk to you while I'm driving the car, and you come in the car and we can talk. So it's that situation. And we did some study. We did it on because I also teach qualitative methods in our Master of Sexology program. We have a very popular Master of Public Health, and we have a very popular Master of Sexology program. And in that, we have very sensitive topics. With sexology, we have topics like transgender issues. We have topics like pornography. We have topics where people are binary and identify as such. So how do you interview these people? And one of my students recently finished, actually, she's a German student. She's written 2 publications, but she had to go back to Germany. But we're going to submit it in the next 2 weeks. She was looking at pornography addiction among young males. And she wanted to talk to this, and we went through this ethics process back and forth, because she really wanted to talk to people about this, and they said, okay, from which countries, how are you going to do this? How is it going to be? So it is possible to do that, to conduct it, but you have to go to the ethics process. And none of the participants, they disclosed which country they were in, but apart from that, they didn't want to be seen or anything of that sort. So she got some very rich data, but it was sensitive and it took a long time for us to get ethics approval, but we did, because we answered all the ethical questions. So it is possible, it's possible, but when you actually look at this ethnographic, when you're observing, you have to be a complete observer in certain situations. You are looking at situations where you want to talk to people. Then at the same time, you can look at talking to a few people. It's possible to do that, but you have to disclose what the intent is and go through the ethics process.
Okay, ma'am. We have got one more question. Bhavne Kale has asked, can participatory research be 100% participatory, especially the analysis part?
It's 100% participatory in many ways. You have collaborated, you have done the field work, but the analysis part, what we tend to do is we do academic analysis using thematic or framework analysis using NVivo software. Most of my students use NVivo, but then we go back, we share those results with the participants so that they see that these are the interview transcript and this is the quote that I'm going to use. So many a times I've done that, and basically that really helps. That really helps with the participants seeing, oh, this is what I said. This is the quote you're going to use, Jaya. And often, if it's a non-sensitive topic, like I did a project with Goan migrants who had come from Goa, but who had come from Goa to Africa, then to Australia, Goa to the Middle East, and then to Australia. I did a project with 100 migrants, but it was a funded project. I had significant funding, and the Goan Association in WA had their 30th anniversary. So they wanted a memento of the 30th anniversary, and we put forward that book to this thing. And I can share that book with Professor Morley one day. I have that here. But in that, I shared the transcripts with all the participants because I wanted to use their names in the quotes. So I had to take permission for them to actually give me permission to use their names, their actual names, one. And the second thing is I needed their permission to use the quotes that I'm using under the various themes: pre-migration, migration, settlement, challenges, and successes. So we had these main themes and which quote would go into which themes.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Let me check. Is there any more question? Okay.
I've seen a comment from an assistant professor, Vatsala Shukla, who's actually currently, she's working at the Research Center for Women's Studies. That's wonderful, Vatsala. It is a small world, isn't it? I did it with Veena Punacha, and you have another person from the Research Center for Women's Studies. So that's good.
Okay, Ipshida has asked one more question. I think she's clarifying something. She has asked about your question on symbolic interactionism. The example I could think of is the attire of Naga sadhus seen at Kumbh Melas, that is considered a symbol of asceticism, mysticism, etc. The religious tradition that they follow is visible in their physical appearance, where a certain color or dress becomes a symbolic representation of a particular culture or tradition. Am I thinking on the right lines? She has asked.
Yes, yes, she is thinking on the right lines. Like India is full of symbols, everywhere you have the symbols. Men, women, the sadhus at Kumbh Melas, the Jain nuns, the Catholic nuns, people, the Muslims, you have had the huge issue in Karnataka. There is a lot of symbolism in the whole of India that comes out very, very strong. And even with some of the gurus. Now, these are the sadhus, but you have like Sri Ravi Shankar, or you have Sadhguru, so all of this actually represents a certain color, a dress, and this. And you have the people who believe in Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, the ISKCON people. And then they have certain symbolisms where they wear that chain, they have a symbolism on their forehead. So all of that, So basically, it is actually very symbolic of a culture and tradition. And interesting for me, I've seen it now all over the world, So you have people having symbols in tattoos. In the Western culture nowadays, tattoos are becoming a big thing, but tattoos are symbolic about certain things. We have that. So yes, it actually represents a certain culture and a tradition. Very true.
What is that, Yamini, you wanted to tell everyone? Funny story for symbolic interactionism. What's that, Yamini?
Yeah, this happened to one of my friends who was doing her fieldwork in Gadchiroli district in Maharashtra. And so she loves wearing black bindis, and she loves wearing toe rings. So she had done field work, and she had spoken to a couple of women, and she had moved on from there, and another group had met the same women. And so as soon as the second group started interacting with them, they're like, yeah, we already spoke to that Vidva Tai who came earlier. And my friend was 22 at the time, and she was like, oh, I'm not married and I'm not a Vidva. So I don't know why they said that. So apparently black bindi signifies, widowed women in the community. And so they just assumed that because she wore the same, she was widowed. And only red bangles, and so they were like, why is she still wearing toe rings? Because she's not supposed to wear toe rings. And they asked the second group of interviewers. So like when you said symbolic and how in India it's so diverse in every region, what each of these small symbols signify. So that was my funny story. But then I thought like, yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Yamini. And now it is time for us to wind up. We are actually using, I feel like a kind of, why should we do this to Jaya? Because we are taking so much of her time, effort, and energy. It is almost 4:35 here. So it is time for your dinner at Australia. So today, the session was so rich with so many things. Not only the participatory methods, the photo voices, and participatory action research, rural appraisal, everything. And it was a rich day with a rich session with so many things. And there was good interaction from the participants. So it really was a very informative, a very interesting session. And on behalf of all the participants, I extend my gratitude to you, Jaya. It was really great. Thank you so much. And all the participants, you also were found to be that much keen and involved in the entire presentation and the questions, the way you express your clarifications and queries, that shows how much you are also involved in this learning exercise. Thank you so much, my dear fellow researchers. And so it is time for us to wind up, and we are meeting tomorrow. And one speciality with tomorrow is, I think it is the most important session, something that we have to learn from this foreign eminent scholar, Jaya Dundas. I don't know how many publications she's having. I wonder how many. And all these publications are published in highly, quoted, high index journals. And so we are going to learn from her how to do our publications, what all things are to be focused in and where to publish, how to move forward after PhD. And all that will be discussed tomorrow. So we have to join at sharp 3 o'clock and without delay, because I'm sure you will be having so many queries tomorrow because that topic is like that. So it is time for us to wind up now. I request all the participants to come on time on tomorrow. And thank you so much, Jaya. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to the session where I'll share how PhD scholars can think about publications, how researchers can think about publications when they are doing their research journey, and it's really, really important to do that for their own research career. And Professor Molly, you and I will talk to continue some research studies in southern India. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Yamini, you can stop the record.